Okay. Hello, everyone. My name is James Kirkham, and I'm a PhD student at the British Antarctic Survey and the University of Cambridge, and I study how ice sheets and glaciers respond to extreme climatic warmth. Very warm welcome to this Cryosphere Pavilion and this event on Cascading Impacts, how we can adapt and reduce risks in mountains downstream, organized by the Adaptation Altitude Program. This event is also very close to my heart personally, as I worked at ISAMOD as a field scientist for some time, and so I've gone into the mountains and seen firsthand how these cascading risks are playing out. I also want to welcome those of you watching virtually. You can pose questions to the speakers in the chat, and these questions will be answered during the question and answer session at the end. I'd now like to turn it over to Alex Mackey from the Adaptation Altitude Program. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much for that warm welcome, and good afternoon, everybody. My name is Alex Mackey, and I'm a project manager at Zoe Environment Network, which is a Geneva-based environmental NGO and also a member of the Adaptation at Altitude program. Adaptation at Altitude here we go. It has its main objective to enhance the resilience and the adaptive capacity of mountain ecosystems and their communities around the world. It's made up of many wonderful partners who all contributed to make this event happen today, which includes the Mountain Research Initiative, GeoMountains, Condizan, ISIMOD, UNEP, the Stockholm Environment Institute, Zoe Environment Network, and the University of Geneva. Adaptation at Altitude is supported by the Swiss Agency for Development and Cooperation, and I'd like to express our sincere gratitude to the SDC for allowing us to be here today, organize this side event, and continue with our mission to raise awareness about the importance of adaptation in the mountains. So we have a wonderful panel here today, but first, before introducing all of them, I'll provide a little bit of context. So I think that we can all agree that mountains are extremely important and bring so much value to our lives. They are a hotspot for biodiversity. They provide a space for agriculture. They offer a way for people to build livelihoods for those living in them. They're an excellent tourist destination for many of us on our holidays and our weekends. And very importantly, they're a source of fresh water for over 2 billion people around the world, many of which who don't even live in the mountains, but rather in cities or along the rivers downstream. This is why mountains are quite aptly called the water towers of the world. Unfortunately, as a result of climate change, a lot of these different aspects about mountains are going to be threatened. And additionally, many of the risks that already exist in mountains are going to be worsened and put many of the world's most vulnerable people at risk. Additionally, mountains are a home, in addition to all of these positive aspects, to a place where there are a lot of potential for natural hazards to originate. So these are avalanches, landslides, wildfires, floods, glacial lake outburst floods, earthquakes, and that's only to name a few. As climate change worsens, so will the frequency and the severity of all of these natural hazards. And that's why we're here talking about them here today. So not only that, but mountains also provide a prime location for compounding and cascading hazards. So this is when hazards actually combine with one another and cause even worse damages as a result of them connecting with one another. Thank you very much. So oftentimes these mountains will start at very high altitudes and then eventually cascade down the mountains downstream and have even worse impacts there as well. I'll give one example of this. So as we know, climate change is going to be changing the precipitation patterns around the world, and this could lead to more severe thunderstorms, which could also lead to heavier than normal rainfall. So that in combination with poorly managed land and deforested land in particular could end up causing a major landslide that rushes down the mountain and essentially crushes everything in its path. This destroys buildings, infrastructure, and can also block water systems like rivers, which blocks access to fresh water supply as well, and could eventually cause a flood as that water breaks through. So this is just one example of how serious that the impacts can be in the mountains if we don't take the opportunity to adapt to them now. If you'd like to learn a little bit more about disaster risk reduction in the mountains, Adaptation at Altitude has launched a new issue brief called Leave No Mountain Behind. You can find it at the table just next to the pavilion. Take one home. And this goes over all the different aspects, how climate change is going to have an impact on managing disaster risk, and also how we can add in mountains into the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction. So if you'd like to learn more, you can check out adaptationataltitude.org or pick one up at the end of this event. So now I'd like to take the opportunity to introduce the first of our wonderful panelists here today, who is Dr. Carolina Adler, the Executive Director of the Mountain Research Initiative, and the co-author of the IPCC cross-chapter paper on mountains, who's going to share a little bit more about the science and the most recent findings. So with that, Carolina.
Right. Good afternoon, everyone. Good to see you here, and hello to those of you who are joining us online. I'll just see if this works. Just trying to get the slides up. So while we get the slides up, I'll just give you a little bit of my background. I'm a geographer and environmental scientist, and have been involved indeed in the IPCC for this sixth assessment, both in the special report on the ocean and cryosphere, as well as the cross-chapter paper, mountains. And before we get stuck into the questions that we will address in this session, indeed, I have the opportunity to share with you just a recap of what have been the key findings from both reports, the special report and the cross-chapter paper in the sixth assessment relating to cascading hazards. So just a recap from SROC, one of the key things that we found after almost 30 years of there being absence of IPCC dedicated space for mountains, quite a considerable body of evidence that is now converging on topics such as how glacier, snow and permafrost, these are the mountain cryosphere, declining and indeed altering the frequency and magnitude and location of most related natural hazards. And the high confidence alludes to the fact that we have this convergence in that evidence from just about every region in the world. One of the key things that we also looked in SROC is the extent of the natural hazard and the exposure that people have to those hazards. And this is increasingly also in terms of infrastructure, not only given the population growth that we've been seeing over the years, but also the extent of development and settlement that is also now increasingly happening in mountains. So the socioeconomic development is also a factor to take into account when we look at not only the vulnerability, but also the exposure element of mountains natural hazards. And one of the key things that we also found in that particular report is that the type of natural hazards are projected indeed to continue changing into the future, not just in terms of frequency and magnitude, but also the extent of area that are affected. And with high confidence again. And one of the key things that we found in this particular chapter as well, this is a high mountain area for one of the first times that we see these explicitly being written, is that all of these events are also emerging in places where there is no record of previous events happening. And that is something to take into account because this is something that is quite new in terms of what we see reported in IPCC reports for mountains. The special report on the ocean and cryosphere was endorsed by the panel in September 2019. And following that, we entered the main assessment cycle with Working Group 1, 2, and 3 reports. And in the Working Group 2 report, we have what's called a cross-chapter paper, Mountains, which is an opportunity for us to bring a synthesis from across the Working Group 2 report on mountains. And one of the key things that we found in terms of cascading impacts is the climate-related disasters. So we have the hazards and contributing to an increase in disasters. This, again, is coming with a high confidence statement attached to it. This is already mainly attributed to the extent to which people are exposed to these hazards. And again, the conclusion in that report also pointed to the projected changes. And this is mainly in the nature of the hazard, but also in terms of the exposure and the severe risk consequence for people and infrastructure and the economy. And this is again coming with high confidence. So we're seeing much of this convergence being reported in the IPCC reports. In the IPCC, we characterize risk as a function of the hazard, the exposure, and the vulnerability of people and ecosystem to those hazards. And this is what we call the risk associated with that projecting forward. Much of the consolidation and synthesis that we brought within the cross-chapter paper led to 4 key risks for which we found substantial evidence and which could also be elevated to the summary for policymakers and the synthesis report as well. So those 4 key risks, number 1, it comes down to landslides and floods and the losses and damages associated with that in terms of losses of lives, harm to people, and damages to infrastructure. And we've seen that quite evident already at 1.15 degree today. So the key risk of this going forward under 1.5 and indeed higher than 1.5 degrees is considerable. A second key risk that we found is changes in water availability. Given the substantial changes that we've seen in terms of how the cryosphere is changing, we are seeing that being translated to the water availability issue. The third one is in changes in mountain ecosystems, and in particular, the risk of mountaintop extinction of endemic species that are not able to go any higher up the mountain, so to speak. So this is also a key risk that we need to take into account, not least given the irreversibility of that loss with future warming. And fourth is the intangible losses and harm. And this is a new dimension that's been looked at within the IPCC assessment report, acknowledging also there are those cultural and significant, I guess, religious and spiritual value attached to the diminishing cryosphere in mountains. And we are starting to see an increasing body of evidence also alluding to how that's affecting the identity that communities have for mountains and in mountains. So this is also something to take into account going forward. All of this has relevance for how we translate into what's called climate resilient development. And the sixth assessment made quite a big effort to try and acknowledge not only the climate related, but also increasingly the non-climate related factors that influence our development pathways going forward. However, indeed exceeding 1.5 and certainly when we exceed 2 degrees, the opportunities for climate resilient development diminish as we go forward. So this is certainly something to take into account, and this has been a key finding also reported in the summary for policymakers, where mountains are very well acknowledged as being one of those places where you see CRD most at risk. And with that, I would like to hand back to my colleagues, and I look forward very much to their discussion and to see how we take forward these findings in terms of action and policy. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Carolina. That was a really great overview. It's really important that we do understand the science behind everything that we're talking about today. And I think it was really interesting also that you brought up how some of these hazards are taking place in areas that haven't previously faced them, which I think really does a good job at highlighting how these issues are really global and they're really not limited to one area. So it's good to have these discussions on a wider level as well. So thank you for that. Next up, I'm going to present Dr. Arun B. Shrestha, who is the Regional Program Manager of River Basins and Cryosphere at ICIMOD, who's going to share a bit more about the experiences in the HKH. So welcome.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Thank you. Thank you very much for the opportunity. I will be talking from Hindu Kush Himalaya perspective, and what Dr. Adler has just presented, actually, the IPCC findings, I guess it very nicely kind of shows what I'm going to show is already happening, right? So what has been put as suggestion for future, some of those are already happening. So these are realities. These are realities happening now, and not just something which could happen in the future, in distant future. But to start with, I think we are here basically to push this agenda that mountains are important. And the slogan is moving mountain, meaning not physically moving. We want mountains to stay there, stable with a lot of ice, no debris flow and floods like that. But what it means is moving the mountain agenda to the forefront, to the center of discussion. Yeah, and the key, that's what I just mentioned. And then and also looking at opportunities. For example, if we are talking about disaster risks or water security, what are the opportunity for investment? So these are the main priority here for us being in this COP in Sharm el Sheikh. But to get into the point, I just wanted, this is very simple presentation I have prepared here, although the graphic looks a little bit complicated, is just to give an example. Some of you are fully aware of what I'm showing here. Some of you might be new to it. This is an event which happened in 2021, right? In June 2021 in an area called Melamji, where, the biggest, probably thing I would mention is a water supply project which has been built for last several years for the purpose of diverting water, interbasin diversion of water from that basin, Melamji Basin, to the capital of Nepal, Kathmandu, right? It's a significant project of national priority. And when this disaster happened, the project was just complete after years and years of delay, and the disaster happened, and the project was significantly actually damaged. So this is one example. But looking at the details of this disaster, what we, after some study of remote sensing and other data, we found out that it is not a simple disaster. It is very complex, and this could be a classic example of multiple and cascading hazards, right? So just I will try to explain what has happened here. Basically, and this is very, very new phenomena in Himalaya, that very high altitude, which is around 4,000 meter. Normally, extreme liquid precipitation does not happen, but in this case, liquid precipitation, rain of around 100 millimeter happened in 24 hours, right? That's one. But then before that, there was antecedent snow cover, thick snow cover. But then it was cold. But then right before this event, the warming started. It got positive. So what you have in very high altitude is heavy snowpack, which is melting rapidly. And on top of that, you have around 90 or 95 millimeter of rainfall overnight. So that is not something that kind of landscape actually is used to. So it could not, actually, take that amount of rainfall, and then that created a flood. On the way, there was a small glacial lake, which was flushed out by the amount of water. So on top of that water runoff, that glacial lake outburst flood added to it. It is in a very high altitude glacial environment, which is very loose surface material. So a lot of surface material was actually eroded by that flood. So when you have water and debris, the capacity to destruct, we know, gets enhanced, right? So things started rolling down. Uh, then it reached this place where it was a old landslide deposit. Uh, and in previous times also, this kind of deposit we used to come and deposit, but because this was a huge event, actually it eroded that deposit and then again created even bigger event, right? And as it went down, it created multiple landslide blocking the river system, eventually, overflowing the landslide dam and creating another flood, and so on and so forth. So that's the location where the water supply project, headwater was located, and it was almost completely damaged, causing at least 15 million US dollars damage there. And then in downstream, when the settlement starts, inundation, debris covering villages, all that kind of things happen. So, right. So this is the kind of thing we are now experiencing, starting from up to the down, different kinds of cascading hazard, extreme events happening in areas where it did not happen in the past. Just quickly, another example. This is from India, Uttarakhand. This is popularly known as Chamoli disaster or Chamoli flood, February 2021. Again, when it happened, a lot of people thought it was a glow, but then there are no glacial lakes of sizable area over there. When we analyze, it happened to be a very strange kind of new phenomena where a large chunk of the mountain mass over there, huge, 500 by more than 500 meter of rock actually collapsed from that front, and that created this flood, right? How did it happen? It is still something which we do not know, but what is the scientists who are involved mentioned that that huge energy that was produced because of that fall of more than a kilometer actually converted into heat, which melted the ice, and that's how the flood happened. Anyways, the downstream impacts are very much similar to Melamji, hydropower, settlements, tunnel, etc. So these are just two examples I wanted to present here, just to show that these are realities in Hindu Kush Himalaya. It is happening. It's happening almost every year now. So my point is the nature of floods in the Hindu Kush Himalaya mountains is changing in recent years, and Chamoli event, that whole mountain collapse, also similar to 2012, the Seti flood, is something which we did not know. So this warming climate is probably creating additional, challenge to the mountain surfaces and creating the instability. The precipitation pattern, as I mentioned, it's not supposed to rain so much in that altitude. It is happening now, extreme, and even more heavier rainfalls are happening, causing the fragile landscape to not withstand that. And of course, land use pattern in the downstream valleys are also changing. The socioeconomic changes are quite dynamic. So in combination, what we see, this multi-hazard risk and cascading impacts are becoming more frequent. Uh, and therefore, we have found that formal and informal early warning systems are very important. In the Melamchi case, also we found that. So having early warning system is very important. I'll talk about that later. Uh, But then what we also found that multi-hazard nature of those disasters actually requires um, multiple or integrated approach, multi-sectoral approach in management, right? So it is not basically just physical aspect of the hazard that needs to be looked at, but multiple sectoral approach probably is should be what we should be doing when we are talking about hazard management in the future. So with that, I end here. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for that presentation. It was very interesting. I think it's always good to have regional examples. It really illustrates exactly what happens during these cascading hazards. And also mentioning that how these events, these hazards can not only threaten lives and cost a lot of money to repair, but they can also threaten existing projects that are perhaps very key for other mitigation projects in the region. So adaptation and mitigation do go hand in hand, and that's also very important to note. So next up, we'll hear from Ms. Christine Kaya Nakamwero, who is the Member of Parliament in Uganda, to share some of her experiences as a policymaker at working to implement strategies in her country. So welcome.
Greetings to all of you. Thank you for this opportunity. I was told that it was necessary to have a PowerPoint, but like I've been introduced, I'm a member of parliament from Uganda, but I also belong to the Climate Change and the Natural Resources Committee of Parliament. And I'm grateful to have been given this opportunity to share with you. In Uganda, we have landslides on the mountains, and we also have breakage of river banks, especially in the mountainous areas. So it is very important at this point to identify that ecosystem-based adaptation is key, because different mountains have different purposes, and the way we handle them should also be different. Some mountains have arable soils that can enable serious agriculture and food production. Other mountains do not support agriculture. So ecosystem-based adaptation is very important. And then when we look at the most important basic necessity for our people who stay in mountains, food is at the forefront. And when the disasters occur, the first basic necessity is the food that they're asking for. So this has led to migrations that are not planned, but even where we plan to take them, we are looking at just settlement, sleeping, but the future of food to the populations that are migrated is still a very big question. So we have to begin also looking at building resilient food production systems. But it is important at this moment that technologies that can take us there are also veiled. The other important aspects that affects us in the mountainous areas is the land tenure security. Tenure security is poor, and the most vulnerable sometimes are evicted. And most of the practices we are talking about, for example, planting trees, are becoming very difficult, because sometimes the investors are looking at growing other things other than food, and then probably the land uses that were earmarked for tourism, for stabilizing the ecosystem of the mountain, may not be a priority to the investors. So it is another issue that we are battling with. It is very important that all of you stakeholders look at parliament beyond the parliamentary chambers. We have this other perception that, members of parliament will be looking at the policy making in the chambers, at the floor of parliament. Members of parliament, we have already gone through the campaigns So we very much know the social aspects of the places we represent. So it is very important to look at Parliament as an instrument that can help keep the countries on target, not only in plenary and premises there, but even outside with the communities that we represent. And this is going to improve the way we represent our people and the way we deliberate or formulate laws. So Uganda in 2022, actually in June this year, we developed a disaster risk management plan. And every time we were discussing with some of you, people were asking us, so how much money do you need as Uganda to implement the plan? And we were forced to, budget and try to cost, especially early actions. And we identified that at least we need $234 million for every 3 years to invest in early actions. We still have a challenge within our within our societies. Investing in early actions is taken to be like leaving money idle. You are leaving money idle. So that perception, we must also build the capacities of very many staff, to inform them that investing in early actions, it is not rendering money idle. Because we are poor nations, we should not be seen to just leave money there, but emphasize the actions that you can spend on as early actions. So we are also battling with that perception. And then we have come up with policies of decentralization, but it is still a challenge to implement them. Too much centralization of disaster management plans. So many of them are still on the top, and the decentralization as if does not cater for disaster risk management. And then, of course, the capacities, we need to build the capacities of our people to mainstream, be able to mainstream disaster risk management, even at their local levels. Because currently it's as if this is an action that is somewhere there. It is a mountain, and there are specific people who are supposed to look at it. So we are still looking at how to mainstream disaster risk management, also in the related laws and legal frameworks. And then we do not have a mainstream disaster risk management law currently, but we have come up with plans, but would like to have the law in place. So the prioritization for having this legal framework is slow. So some of us, the activists, were, trying to make it, speed it up. Because sometimes when laws come as public bills, they take long. Sometimes when we bring them as the private bills, they are faster. But the latter sometimes has an impact that many of the stakeholders are not aware of their responsibilities. So we prefer these laws to come as public laws, but we are challenged with the speed. And then my colleague has already talked about the issue of addressing multi-hazardly, planning for multi-hazard approach other than the specific hazard approach. Because we look at the effects affecting different sectors. So if we were just only looking at, for example, farmers from the mountainous areas, what will happen to the constructors? We just need a multi-hazard focus in order to offset the effects. And then media. I don't know what is happening to your countries, but interesting media to, prioritize early actions is a challenge. But when they hear that, somebody has died because of landslide, we have lost this and this number of people, the media is quick at, showing all that. But the early actions and the need for the media to prioritize these actions actually want attention from many stakeholders, and it is the media to help us. So we need to develop mechanisms for interesting the media in early actions other than response. Because if we don't invest $1, we are bound to invest over $15 of action in response. So that is the challenge we are looking at. But it is very important that we focus on the financing and then prioritize the exact items for our early actions. Like I've told you, the perceptions out there, especially in developing countries, is that early actions is rendering money redundant, which is not the truth. We are looking at early actions to help us build resilience for agricultural food production, because food is actually primary, is basic, is survival, and not a secondary human right. So we find that probably that is when the people who have been affected by climate-induced migrations will still survive. So these are not secondary human rights, but actually primary and basic human rights that we'd like to address. And I would like to thank you very much for having prioritized the mountainous areas and how to build resilience of the people who stay along these mountains. And we hope for the best. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for providing us this perspective as a policymaker, and especially for touching on the points of how important it is to prioritize different actions depending on which geographical location you're in. And I'd also like to say that it was very important to have referenced the notion of transferability. Of course, different mountain areas are going to have different needs and have different priorities, and it's going to have different actions that are required for them. So thank you very much for mentioning that for us today. Our last speaker is going to be Mr. Helmut Hojeski, who is the director at the Austrian Federal Ministry for Climate Action, the chair of the Alpine Climate Board, and the National UNFCCC focal point for Austria. So with that, welcome, Helmut.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Alex. Yeah, thank you very much for the kind invitation. As the previous speakers have said, mountain regions are definitely harmed by climate change. More than double the temperature increase and other situations. So we have more hazards, and Carolina has shown this, and Arun's examples really worrying showed us it's already there. We have the detrimental effects around us, and we must act. Mountainous regions have a special status in the Framework Convention, so it's mentioned, and so we have to keep an eye on this, but also follow on mitigation. You said, Alex, it's equally important, of course, since Paris. Both mitigation and adaptation is on equal footing, and I want to underline this continuously. We need both. Even if we would stop our emissions globally by now, we would have negative impacts in the next decades. So we must adapt. We heard a lot of really worrying examples. Coming from an alpine country, we suffer not such extreme events, but you may remember the collapse or the partial collapse of the Marmolada Glacier this summer. We suffer, at least in Austria, from water supply problems already, because we see that our winter precipitation is decreasing. So we have less snow cover, and so the glaciers are melting because there's no snow cover on the glaciers anymore. So the darker ice is melting more than a white snow cover. And all this is happening now and will increase. Alex, you mentioned the Alpine Climate Board. So we are working within the Alpine Convention. This is our framework on an climate target system, and we have defined pathways how to tackle these different issues, sector by sector, in fact. So it's not adaptation across all sectors, but specifically looking on sectors like transportation, like mountain agriculture, and so on. So that's indeed key, and we try to move on here. I would like to stop also, first of all, to thank UNEP and the other collaborating institutions for the project adaptation at altitudes. Some of you, I think, have been to Vienna recently. In June, finally, it worked after some postponements, and we were really happy to bring you to the RAX, where you saw. Well, we looked at some forest fire. This is not directly the topic here, but is also an impact of climate change, drought in alpine forests. So this is really key, and we really support this collaboration between the different mountainous regions. So I had the pleasure of sharing our views and experiences with other mountainous regions as HKH, Caucasus region, the Andes, and especially East Africa. And you may know the project Mountains Adapt, and I'm happy to announce that we will spend €1 million next year for this project. I know it's a small amount, but for a small country, it's quite big. But this is only the first step. We will support 3 countries in the Caucasus region, Southern Caucasus, but also 7 countries, including Uganda in East Africa. So the aim of this support is to exchange views and to really help with pilot projects, how we can work and adapt to the danger which we face in future. And for the next 3 years, 2024 to 2026, there will also be money. The sum is not fixed yet, and the regions are not fixed. But as a first step, I think I hope we can help supporting hands-on adaptation solutions in these 2 mountainous regions. So thank you very much, and looking forward to a rich discussion. Thank you.
All right, while we get the mics working, thank you very much, Helmut, for sharing your experiences from Austria and also for highlighting the importance of regional collaboration and interregional collaboration as well. We have partners here from all over the world, so it's good to know that people are committed to working together. So now we've also had the opportunity to hear a lot of the disaster risk, natural hazard related risks, which of course is very significant. But now I'd like to turn a little bit over to a more positive note, and we'll have an opportunity to share some of the more different strategies that we have for working on adaptation in the mountains. So first, I'd like to turn to Carolina. And so, of course, you spoke a lot about the science, but I wanted to know if you could share with us what recent advances are helping to close this knowledge gap for implementing DRR in the mountains.
I think it works now?
Yes.
Great. Thanks for the question. There are many things I could mention, but I think I will just focus on 2 key points. One that has already been mentioned by the Member of Parliament, Christine here, and this is on the key knowledge that is place-specific to be able to implement solutions that work for the context in which they are meant to work. So knowledge on the conditions and mechanisms under which certain solutions work is important to distill for every mountain region and area in the world. Mountains, as we know, are globally distributed, fragmented, and of course they also take place in unique sociocultural circumstances. So that is also important to consider. The hazard itself may well be characterized in very similar terms, but how they manifest and intersect with societies and also the disasters that result from that are unique to the context. So this is important for us to continue working towards distilling better. I think in the sixth assessment, we certainly made some progress in seeing that evidence come through. But for the seventh assessment, we would definitely like to see more strengthen in the evidence basis to support how those particular solutions work. And the second point I wanted to mention is also in relation to early warning systems. I think we're certainly becoming much better at recognizing the types of data and information that make these early warning systems fit for purpose. And that is particularly important for mountains. With the global network on observations and information in mountain environments, GeoMountains, which is one of the projects that the MRI is helping to co-lead within the group on Earth observation context. This is certainly something that we are building to continue working on and supporting the data and information, as I said, that is fit for purpose for the mountain context. Early warning systems will definitely become an area of much improvement and much work going forward. And so this is certainly one of those areas that we've seen a good input into disaster risk reduction more generally. Thanks.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Carolina. And also, Arun mentioned earlier about early warning systems and the importance of them too in responding to these disasters. So I'd like to turn back to the HKH now and just ask, how does regional cooperation help in responding to disasters such as this? What is it that can be done at the regional level that you think is more positive?
Thank you. Thank you for the question. Very important one. Now, let me go back to what I had suggested. I had shown, and if you remember, this is one kind of phenomena that I said is happening, right? But when we talk about transboundary or regional kind of aspect, I think there is a need, I would say, to think a little bit deeply and broadly. Let me explain why. And it all depends on the nature. Now, if it is about flood, flood has a distinct upstream and downstream linkage, right? It starts somewhere in the upstream and then it flows downstream. So in terms of cooperation, although there are a lot of challenges, right? Institutional governance and all kind of technical and capacity, but at least from that sense of linkage, relatedness, there are some sort of simplicity. So transboundary cooperation for flood is a bit more tangible. That's what I would say. Let's talk about landslide also. If it turns into flood, it has a similar kind of nature, gulf probably also. But then there are other kinds of hazard that we are seeing, which the spatial extent definitely spills over different territories, national as well as international territories. But then that kind of linearity, that linkage is not very clear, and that's where it becomes difficult for cooperation. And it is also very important. Let's say, for example, issue of drought, which is getting more and more serious in some part of Hindu Kush Himalaya region. So there, it spills over different areas, but then cooperation in understanding, sharing information, forecasting drought, and of course managing is very limited. And when we talk about managing droughts, it's not just about making water available. There are a lot of dimensions to drought. It's about food, right? It's about livelihood. So I think that kind of cooperation have to be looked at, not just that. So that is what I would say in terms of our understanding of transboundary and regional cooperation in DRR. Um, Now, of course, there are certain good examples. Uh, we have been talking about early warning system quite a lot, and you have also talked about it's important. I talked about it. So early warning systems can be of different types, different complexity, technologically, financially. Our experience has been more in community-based early warning systems, which are very simple, l- let's say simple in technology, but also low economically more attractive because it is community based. But we have found it very effective, not only in a national scale, but also we have examples where community based early warning system can work across international boundaries, especially in the border between Nepal and India, where it's open border and communities are very much common related. So early warning system have been very effectively used in the transboundary scale, right? So that's one example. But then, as I said, not always those transboundary dimensions are very clear. So we need to see many different ways of cooperating. And just one example I would like to mention is, knowledge networks. I think we need broader cooperation in DRR, larger scale flooding and disaster events actually require more formal mechanism for sharing information and cooperation. But if you look at Hindu Kush Himalaya today, the status is it's very at a very early stage. The cooperation around DRR or water per se is very limited, and I think it will take several years for us to have meaningful, formal cooperation mechanism. And therefore, we think knowledge networks, knowledge cooperation is very important, and we have examples like Upper Indus Basin Network, which is a network of countries sharing upstream part of Indus Basin, 4 countries: Afghanistan, China, India, and Pakistan. The idea is to have a semi-formal network where government and academia and other non-governmental organizations can come and share information, share knowledge, and also have joint research programs, which eventually could lead to more formal mechanism, more formal cooperation around DRR and other broader climate and water related issues. So we have example in Upper Indus Basin. Another example is in Koshi Basin, Koshi DRR Knowledge Hub. So these are some of the examples I would like to share, but there are quite a lot to be done. Thank you.
Of course, thank you so much. And that's very interesting, especially when you talk about how we share information in these knowledge networks. I think that that's also very key. So I think looking toward the Alps, then, Helmut, how does it work in the Alps? How do you share these solutions and experiences that are successfully being implemented within the Alpine region?
Yeah, thank you. Well, we share information in the vertical level. So each party to the Alpine Convention, of course, um, shares information with the regions, with the provinces, and the local level. That's key. But the horizontal exchange of views is as important as the vertical one. So what we try within our work of the Alpine Climate Board and the Climate Action Plan adopted by the ministers of the Alpine Convention is that we try to establish or use existing instruments to share information between parties, but also NGOs, including the local and regional level. So we want to learn from each other, from the good results, but also from the mistakes we did. If you look at the avalanche and torrent control, which has been a tradition in Austria for decades, this was mainly, building a lot of concrete and steel in steep slopes. This will not work in future because permafrost is melting. So we are looking more towards nature-based solutions. We try to renaturalize river basins and so on, also the torrents. So we have to change our attitude, how to cope with the hazards ahead of us, because all the impacts we will face in the future we cannot do by simply have concrete in all our mountainous areas. This doesn't work. So sharing within the Alpine Convention family, but also with other mountainous regions. As I've said, we had several workshops. I remember one with the Andes region. I remember the last one with the HKH region. So this is equally important. And we have a close cooperation with the Carpathian Convention. And we try to learn from each other. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And then, so Christine, you spoke a lot about how in Uganda maybe the priorities for adaptation are perhaps different in the mountains there as compared to others. But maybe you could talk a little bit more about your experience in implementing these adaptation actions, and maybe what some of the barriers are and how they can be overcome for you as a policymaker in Uganda.
Thank you. Most of the climate-induced migrations occur to mountain populations. People who originally settled in the mountains actually form the biggest number of populations that are being migrated within Uganda. But they have a lot of attachments. There are gender issues that actually bar different policymakers and actions from following the early warning. For example, forecasts sometimes can show the possibility of a landslide occurrence. But then somebody is like, you telling me to leave this place, where am I going? How am I going to leave the natives and the burial places? How am I going to leave this fertile place? Where you are taking me, I see it is a place that is prone to drought. How am I going to stay there? So there are a number of gender attributes that actually fail some of the early warning practices and actions to take place. And then the populations end up waiting for the actual occurrence of the disaster. That is when they are like, please come and take us. But at that moment, it is very expensive for our country. So that is a serious challenge. And then the disaster risk maps and the provision of their updates. We still have some challenges with that technology. Somehow, somewhere, the maps you will see will be showing some old projections. And then they are not also coordinated. The different ministries, based on their sectors, are focusing on different disasters. The agricultural one may they may show the disaster related to agricultural practices. Then you come up with the water, you come up with the forests, vegetation. And so we have different maps which are not coordinated. And yet, like I already expressed my experiences, we need multi-hazard planning such that every sector is incorporated at once. Every sector is mainstreaming DRR, and because we also lack the general national level legal framework, then we do not have a point for converging all these plans. So our database is still a challenge, which we'll also need to look into. But when we strengthen the capacities of the local people, because in disaster management, indigenous contributions are very important. But now, the local structures and institutions sometimes may not give clear attention to some of these indigenous contributions, in which we need to actually build the capacities in order for them to appreciate them. There are some of those practices and be able to build the resilience of the communities in livelihood improvement. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I'm hearing that coordination is key. I think that's a common message that I'm hearing. Also, that approaches should be multi-hazard, cross-sectoral, and always amplify Indigenous voices as well, because that's another very important aspect. At this time, I'd like to give an opportunity to the audience. If anyone has any questions for one of our panelists, you can raise your hand here, and then maybe the tech team can indicate if there have been any that have come in online as well. So, okay. We will have the microphone run over to you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Jacqueline. I represent the UN Major Group for Children and Youth. So my question is, rather it's two. So we all talked about corporation, multi-hazards. So I am wondering how you are engaging the all of a society approach we took in the Sendai framework by engaging all stakeholders when we speak about disaster risk reduction. That is one. Second is we talked about a lot of the IPCC report and all the findings on the impact on the mountains. I'm wondering, is there any initiative or the work has been taken in your area of work to contribute to the Sendai midterm review, which I believe would be very important planning to the next phase till the 2030, where our frameworks would end and we will rethink about what next would be. So that's to second question. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Two very relevant questions. Looking at the first one about how we can make sure that we're engaging all stakeholders with our efforts, does anyone here want to respond to this question?
Yeah, brief response from my side. The Alpine Climate Board does not only include parties to the Alpine Convention, but also observers, so NGOs. We don't have a formal youth representative, but we are continuously exchanging with youth. We have 2 youth delegates in our Austrian delegation to the COP since many years. So we work closely with NGOs outside their normal discussions with parties or amongst parties. On the DRR, I can't say much because I'm not responsible for that, sorry, but maybe someone else.
Thank you very much. It is very important for countries to engage in review of the implementation of the Sendai framework. And like I already testified, that for my country, we had a review of the performance as far as Sendai targets are concerned. But sometimes it's also not consistent. We need to regionalize them and check ourselves as countries. How far have we gone with the implementations of the targets that we set ourselves to do? I think that one just needs to be regionalized because we had it this year. Last year we didn't have it, and I know even the same applies to some of the countries. Checking ourselves as far as we are implementing the targets, not only with the Sendai framework, but also with the UNFCCC targets and the Paris targets. So it is upon all of us to regularize these reviews. Thank you.
Thank you. Did anyone else want to respond to either of the questions?
Just very briefly to the question on the midterm review of the Sendai framework. Indeed, I think what the IPCC outputs have indicated is a lot of information that is relevant also in the context of Sendai, not least because in this 6th assessment, we were also required to take a more holistic and comprehensive look at climate-related issues, but also the non-climate-related conditions that can lead to many of these disasters as well. So this is one key aspect that, at least from an IPCC perspective, is certainly relevant and important to reflect in this midterm review. And one other element that I would like to also highlight for the midterm review is also the mountain specificities and the challenges that are faced in mountain conditions, where we see a lot of extreme and large impacts within relatively short distances, simply because of the elevation and gradient that we experience in these particular areas. So the types of settlements that are exposed to hazards, sometimes in relatively close distance. And so taking into consideration the mountain geographies, if you like, is important to consider. And that is not often well reflected in how the targets and the conditions under which we report disaster and disaster risk reduction are within the current Sendai framework as it stands. So there is certainly room to improve in terms of making this far more relevant also for mountain specific conditions. Thanks.
I can talk about the involvement of multi-stakeholders. I think that's very important. And in my presentation also, I kind of mentioned that, since we are moving more into the multi-hazard kind of environment, that definitely needs multi-stakeholder involvements. From the physical side, it is not just flood, it's not just drought, it's not just landslide. So experts on many different subjects and institutions, expert institutions on those subjects have to be involved, right? But the more important issue is, I think you have explained the concept. The risk is basically hazard, vulnerability, and exposure. The hazard environment is changing. I think that I have talked about. What is now more important, and especially from our area, the Hindu Kush Himalaya, the exposure is changing with socioeconomic changes. The exposure is going to be very important. Now, when we talk about exposure, then multi-stakeholders involvement will be very, very important. There are different sectors involved. Different sectors are at risk, so they have to be involved. And lastly, I would mention, in all this, community should be very much important. And I think I gave example of community-based early warning system, which puts community at center. It's with community, it's for community. So we have ample examples in the region where very nice, expensive, high-tech systems have been put in place, but somehow community was not part of the system. They were not involved. Uh, so although they are the beneficiaries, they are intended beneficiaries, they did not really own the system, and then the system did not work, right? So I think we have a lot of examples. So I think in going into the future, we should learn and not repeat those, let's say, bad examples. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Does anyone else have a question to ask at this time? Bring. Yeah.
Yes, thank you everyone for your insightful presentations. My name is Pragya Sirsan and I am from Nepal. And my question is for all of you. Actually, I also belong to the mountainous area, and that's why Christsphere is near to me. And what I would like to add here is, like, everyone is talking about the collaboration and multi hazards and things, but I also like to add multi hazards and uncertainties that we are facing in Nepal. In Nepal last year, there was a devastating flood in Medamchi region. Uh, there was a early warning system, though people are already aware about the flood that is coming from the upstream, because but the people over there have never experienced the flood in that region. And also would like to mention that in our national vulnerability analysis, the place lies in the low range on flood, but that's why they are not so concerned about the risks they are gonna face. So people didn't care about that early warning message, and they have a huge loss on their settlement, their agricultural lands, everything was washed away. So I think in the hazard mapping also, do we need to change the attributes of risks so that we can also address the uncertainties that are lying in the surface, and people can be more aware on this kind of uncertainties in the countries like us, where people are already suffering from poverty and other things. Yes, thank you.
Thank you. And maybe we can have the other question asked as well, just to save some time.
Hello, my name is Samip. I'm from University of Bayreuth, from Nepal as well. So my question is regarding the monitoring systems already present in uh, in the regions in the Hindu Kush Himalayas and other cryosphere regions. Is the current monitoring system able to address uh, all these new kinds of disasters and risks that we are facing? Like example that that Dr. Arun just gave about the rock slides, which we didn't even know about. So is the current monitoring system able to address those, or is there newer research or technologies which are still yet to be deployed, which will, or is it just a lack of manpower where people are not being trained to look at this the way that is required to address all these new and developing risks as the climate change is increasing with the 1.5 degrees Celsius nearing. So that's my question. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Both very good questions. Would anyone like to respond first to either of them at this stage? They're hard questions, but
Yeah, let me try to be brave enough to answer those questions. Um, yeah, multi-hazard and uncertainty, and how to deal with it. I think it's a big question. As it is clear, the hazard environment is changing. The precipitation at high altitude, unprecedented kind of phenomena happening. We do not know what's going to happen. I think these are all the challenges the communities are facing. Um, so this is the reality. What I would say, I would not say that I have answer to this, but I think looking at it more holistically, probably if it is a development effort, let's say in the Melanchi water, uh, not only looking at risks in the immediate vicinity, immediate surrounding, but having a basin approach. What is upstream? If there are lakes present in the upstream or other kind of risks present in the upstream, I think that probably is something which now moving into the future we should be doing more, not looking at point, but looking at the surrounding. Um on monitoring system, I think definitely not. HKH is known for very inadequate monitoring system, right? So that is a very big problem. One big problem is not having monitoring system. Second, not having access to information from existing monitoring system. So these two in combination results in large data gaps. So, in my opinion, I think we need to work on, of course, strengthening the monitoring and making them sustainable, right? Having good quality information, but also accessible information, uh, so that the science community and others can actually access those and do more meaningful research out of it for the benefit of people. And then also use many different approaches for understanding the changes and the impacts, right? Because we cannot create the system now today. So utilizing different kind of approaches, for example remote sensing based approaches, or even using citizen science, for example, or community knowledge, local knowledge probably would be very very useful going forward. So I think what I think is we need to use all possible ways to reduce our knowledge gap, and that's the only way I think we could go. Yeah, thank you.
Just very briefly on monitoring, that's a very good question. And in fact, at recent version 2 of the in situ inventory of mountain observations and mountain observatories that we've collected through GeoMountains, we have over 51,000 records of instrumentations and observatories that are currently located in mountain areas. And with it, associated with it, are of course quite a large number of data sets and information that is available within a reasonably good long-term record of that data. And this is also what we need for mountains long-term records. So the question that raised for us is not so much the number of monitoring campaigns or monitoring instrumentation that is out there in mountains, but rather what's the access. And I think Arun made a very good point about the accessibility of such data and having it in a format that allows us to also combine and interrelate and interpolate different types of data. The interrelation of the different types of data is an important aspect that we need to consider, because we are not just simply monitoring certain variables like temperature or precipitation, but also others that are more proxy-like, that allows us to build a much more comprehensive picture of how change is happening in mountains. And what is also important to recognize is, of course, the rate of change, not just in a horizontal sense in terms of area, but also vertically along an elevation gradient. And that is an added challenge that we see in mountains. But like I said, 51,000 plus points on data points of places that are currently monitoring change in mountains is quite significant, much more than what we expected. But the question now becomes, are they collecting the data that is in fact relevant in the formats that are needed for us to do something with it? And second, also the access to it. Who has access to it, and how is that able to reach those that in fact need it in the formats and amounts that we actually need? So thank you.
All right, thank you very much. So at this time, I think unfortunately we are almost out of time, and the next event's going to come along and start soon. So I just wanted to give an opportunity to each of the speakers. If you had, one key message to take away when in terms of disaster risk reduction in the mountains, what would you say? What's something that we should hold with us moving forward as a priority action area? So does anyone want to speak?
Thank you very much. My last word would be to strengthen the monitoring of the early warning systems, as well as focusing on management of risks. I mean on management of disasters other than management of risks. And also to invest technologies in early actions. Thank you.
Thank you. Taking this opportunity, I would like to mention that, sharing knowledge is very important. Learning from each other in terms of what good practices have been there in different countries in the world is very important. So for that, we have put together what is called a resilience platform. That's a platform which populates information about different efforts in increasing resilience, not necessarily DRR, but also different other resilience related, efforts. It is still in the early stage. So what I would like to use this opportunity is to request, if you have any examples, please share with us, and we'll try to, put it in the platform so that it becomes accessible to more people. Thank you.
Yeah, let's continue our collaboration. We have different circumstances, but definitely one common goal. We want to preserve our mountainous regions to be a livable environment, and that's in spite of all the difficulties we face. Thank you.
I'd just like to end by highlighting that for us to aim at a disaster risk reduction and adaptation to climate change, both require also us to consider reducing emissions. We absolutely need to limit warming in the mountains at 1.5 degrees is already quite a considerable risk that mountain regions face. Already at 1.15 degrees today, we are experiencing large amounts of losses and damages associated with climate, but also non-climate related hazards in mountains. Therefore, this is also an appeal for us to consider jointly adaptation and mitigation going forwards. Thanks.
Thank you very much, and thank you to all the speakers for sharing so many very interesting initiatives, whether it's to help us understand the science a little bit better to make more informed policy decisions, or all of the regional collaboration opportunities that there exist already. And finally, that we do need to take a multi-hazard and intersectoral approach across the board, and that we can take advantage of the best practices that already exist. So thank you all so much for sharing. And thank you all for coming out to the event. If you'd like to learn more about the Adaptation at Altitude program, you can visit us on our website, adaptationataltitude.org, or visit us after the event. So thank you all and have a great day.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming. That concludes our event, and our next event will begin shortly. That will be on partnerships across mountainous communities. Thank you.